Hi.
When I first saw him standing at my door with a toolbox in hand and that familiar, sun-worn smile, I didn't think twice. He lived just one floor above, had always nodded politely in the elevator, and I barely noticed him beyond the occasional hallway hello. But that day was different. My husband had just left on another business trip, the kitchen sink was leaking again, and I was exhausted, not physically, but from the silence that had taken root in our home. I let the neighbor in. It was supposed to be a simple fix. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. He knelt by the cabinet, sleeves rolled up, forearms strong and marked with old scars. I stood behind him, arms folded, trying not to notice the way his shirt clung to his back or how his voice sounded warmer than anything I'd heard at home in months. When he looked up and asked, "You all right?" something inside me stumbled. I nodded too quickly, then offered him tea, not because I was being polite, but because I suddenly didn't want him to leave. That night, after he was gone, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, fingers hovering above his number I never saved, thinking, should I thank him again? Should I let it go? I didn't call. Not that night. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me, like I was seen. 3 weeks later, everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, my limits, would shatter. But before I tell you how that moment on the kitchen floor changed my life, let me ask you something first. Where are you watching this from? And have you ever crossed a line you swore you never would, not out of lust, but because someone finally made you feel alive again? It started with the ceiling, not some grand metaphor or poetic image. Just an actual crack, running across the kitchen plaster like a vein under pale skin. It had been there for months, small, barely noticeable at first, something my husband said he'd get around to after his next trip. Then the next trip. And the one after that. Eventually, it became easier to ignore than to nag. I lived with it, like I lived with everything else that had quietly broken over the years. The window that didn't shut right. The bedroom lamp with a flickering bulb. The long silences that filled our evenings like fog. The day he left for Madrid, I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time. We stood by the front door as he zipped up his suitcase, checking his watch every minute like it owed him money. He kissed my cheek, not lips, not even a lingering touch, and said, "Don't forget to water the ficus." Then he was gone. That I stood there for a while after the door closed. Not frozen, just numb. Like when your hand falls asleep and you can't tell if it's still attached. I looked around the house and felt it staring back, clean, silent, and entirely empty. The leak started the next day. Water pooled slowly under the kitchen sink, darkening the edges of the cabinet. I took a towel to it, then another, until I finally gave up and shoved a bowl beneath the pipe like a lazy bandage. I could have called a plumber. But instead, I texted him, not my husband. The neighbor. He had given me his number a few months ago after fixing a broken step in the stairwell. "If you ever need help," he'd said, in that offhand tone men use when they don't want to seem too forward. I had never used it. Until now. The message was short. "Hi, it's me from 304. There's a leak under my sink. Any chance you're free this week?" He responded almost instantly. "I'm free this afternoon if that's not too soon." It wasn't that I didn't change clothes. Didn't reapply lipstick or fluff my hair. But I did look in the mirror longer than usual, smoothing the sleeves of my blouse, adjusting the angle of my necklace, brushing an invisible crumb from my cheek. Just in case, when he knocked, it was firm. Confident. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. He smelled faintly of sawdust and something citrusy. Like soap that belonged to another decade. He walked in like he'd done it before. Kneeling by the sink, he peered into the cabinet and let out a low whistle. "Looks like the pipes rusted through. Surprised it held this long." I nodded. "It's been like that for a while." He glanced up at me, eyes crinkling at the corners. "You should have said something earlier." I didn't have an answer to that. Not one I could say out loud. He got to work quickly. Tools out. Sleeves rolled. The usual sounds of metal tapping metal, a wrench tightening around a bolt. But underneath it all, there was something else, a quiet awareness. I watched the muscles in his forearm shift as he turned the pipe, the way his back moved under the thin fabric of his shirt. I told myself it was just gratitude. That I was simply watching someone help me. Nothing more. But when he turned and asked, "You okay?" I realized I hadn't taken a breath in nearly a minute. "I'm fine." I lied, stepping back and gesturing to the stove. "Would you like some tea? Or water?" "Tea would be great," he said. I in the kitchen, I moved slower than usual, aware of every movement. The clink of the spoon. The steam rising from the mug. My fingers trembled just enough to make the spoon rattle against the rim. He took the tea with a thank you, sipped, and set it beside him. Then, silence. Not awkward. Not empty. Just still. I sat on a stool by the counter, watching him. He didn't speak much, focused on the task. But occasionally he'd glance up, catch my eye, and hold it a second too long. Long enough to wonder. Long enough to feel something shift between us. He finished the repair in under 20 minutes, all set, he said, standing up and wiping his hands on a cloth. I walked him to the door, not knowing what to say. Thank you felt too small. Goodbye felt too final. I opened the door and stood beside it, unsure. That's when it happened. He paused. Looked at me. Not the way neighbors look at each other, but the way someone does when they've been holding something back and finally decide not to. His hand brushed mine as he passed. Not by accident. Let me know if anything else needs fixing, he said. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. After he left, I stood in that same doorway for a full minute, staring at nothing. Then I walked to the kitchen, turned on the tap, and watched the water run smoothly from the faucet, unbroken. The pipe was fixed. But something else had cracked. Not outside. Inside. Quietly. Cleanly. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The same crack still ran across it like a scar. I reached for my phone once. Twice. Finally opened his message and reread it. I'm free this afternoon. I never deleted it. Just turned off the screen and placed it under my pillow, not because I needed to remember, but because part of me hoped he'd write again. The morning after he left, I noticed how quiet the apartment felt. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with solitude, but something heavier. A silence that had weight, like a thick curtain drawn across my thoughts. The kind of silence that presses against your chest when you're alone, not because there's no one else there, but because you finally realize how little you've heard your own voice lately. I didn't make the bed. I let the covers stay tangled. And walked barefoot into the kitchen, only to be greeted by the faint smell of citrus and metal that still lingered in the air. I stood in the doorway, looking down at the cabinet under the sink, now fixed, polished, whole, unlike me. I thought about texting him. Just a quick thank you, something casual. But the screen felt cold in my hand. I couldn't even type a word without overthinking it. In the end, I locked my phone and set it face down on the kitchen table. The day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself, folded laundry, wiped the windowsill, even organized the spice rack alphabetically, something I hadn't done in years. But every task led me back to the same thoughts. Him. The way he looked at me when I offered tea. The way his fingers brushed mine, just enough to send something trembling through me. It had been years since a man looked at me like that. My husband. Used to, in the beginning. I remember catching him staring at me while I read or folded clothes, and how it used to make me blush. But somewhere along the way, those glances faded, replaced by updates on flight times and reminders about bills. Not out of cruelty, just routine. Like we both gradually turned into furniture in each other's lives, useful, familiar, and mostly ignored. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did alone, and sat on the balcony. The sky was a muted shade of lavender, fading into blue. I watched people walk their dogs below, couples holding hands, teenagers laughing too loudly. I felt like I was behind glass, watching life happen without me. At some point, my gaze drifted up, toward the 4th floor. His window was dark. No signs of life. I told myself I wasn't disappointed, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. The next day, I tried to return to normal. I cooked, even though I wasn't hungry. I listened to music, something soft and instrumental, hoping it would fill the spaces that felt too big. But the ache only grew. In the late afternoon, I heard footsteps in the stairwell. Not the rushed kind, but steady, deliberate. A knock followed, familiar, measured. I froze for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. Then I opened the door. He stood there with a small brown box in his hands. Thought I'd drop this off, he said. Left it behind yesterday. It was one of his tools. A metal clamp, nothing significant. Still, the gesture wasn't about the object. It was about the reason to return. I took it without speaking, and our fingers met again, only briefly. But this time, it felt different. Like something acknowledged but unspoken. I can come back later, he added, sensing my hesitation. No, it's okay, I replied, stepping aside. He walked in like before, casual but aware. We moved into the kitchen, where the air still held a faint memory of yesterday. He set the tool on the table and leaned slightly against the counter, arms crossed. I didn't get a chance to ask, he said. Did the repair hold overnight? Yes. I nodded. Perfectly. Thank you. We stood there for a moment in that stillness, the kind that demands someone speak or leave. But neither of us moved. Finally, I gestured to the table. Tea? He smiled. If it's not too much trouble. I moved through the motions as if rehearsed, boiling water, choosing mugs, setting the table, all while feeling the pull of his presence just a few steps behind me. When I handed him the cup, our fingers brushed again. Neither of us flinched this time. He took a sip and looked around. You keep things very neat. I try, I said. Helps with the silence. He looked at me then, really looked. You're Alone a lot, aren't you? It wasn't a question as much as a recognition. I didn't answer, not directly. Instead, I sat down across from him and stared into my cup. My husband travels for work, I said finally. Always has. I used to go with him sometimes, but eventually, it just became easier not to. He nodded, taking another sip. I get that, he said. Some things just wear down over time. Like pipes under a sink, I added, and we both let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't funny, not really, but it was something. A shared rhythm. The conversation drifted from there. Not deep, not emotional, just safe. We talked about the building's aging infrastructure, the neighbors we barely knew, the weather. But underneath every word, I felt something shifting. Like two people tiptoeing along the edge of something they couldn't name yet. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the doorway. I followed, not out of politeness, but because I wanted those last seconds. Let me know if anything else breaks, he said, his voice softer this time. I nodded, lips parted but silent. There was so much I could have said. Thank you. Be careful. Don't come back. Instead, we both paused, and we kissed. We didn't speak afterward. He left as calmly as he arrived, and I closed the door behind him with trembling fingers. I leaned my forehead against the wood and let the weight of what just happened settle into my bones. I should have felt guilt, or panic, or something louder than this humming stillness. But instead, I felt alive. Startled by how quickly something dormant had come awake. Later that night, I sat in bed with the lights off, listening to the distant hum of traffic through the cracked window. I replayed every detail, the glance, the silence, the warmth of his skin. My heart beat faster with each memory, not out of fear, but from the sense that a line had been crossed and there was no going back. I thought about my husband, where he was, what he might be doing. I imagined him in some hotel room, watching TV with his phone face down beside him. I wondered if he ever thought about me between meetings, or if I had simply become part of the backdrop of his life. As I turned off my phone, I noticed one of the screws from the repaired cabinet lying near the edge of the sink. A small, silver reminder that not everything was finished, and maybe never would be. I left it there. Just for now. The following days unfolded with a strange clarity, as if my senses had been sharpened. I noticed things I had overlooked for years, the way light moved across the kitchen floor in the early morning, how the sound of birds filtered in through the bathroom window when the world was still quiet. These weren't profound changes, but they were enough to remind me that I was still here. Still breathing. Still capable of feeling something that wasn't numb. I didn't reach out to him. And he didn't reach out to me. But the absence of communication felt just as loud as the words we hadn't said. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, I felt a flicker of anticipation, quickly followed by a wave of guilt when it turned out to be anything but him. I checked the hallway through the peephole more than once a day, telling myself it was out of habit, not hope. Inside the apartment, I moved carefully, as though my surroundings were suddenly fragile. Every room seemed heavier now, full of memories. And moments that no longer fit neatly into the life I thought I had. I lingered in the bedroom longer than usual, standing at the foot of the bed and running my fingers along the fabric of the duvet. The scent of my husband's cologne had mostly faded from his pillow. I realized I hadn't changed the sheets in weeks. On a whim, I pulled the covers back and stripped the bed. As I did, a corner of a photograph poked out from under the mattress. One of our anniversary photos from years ago. We were smiling, standing in front of a lake somewhere in Vermont. My hair was longer then. His hands were around my waist. We looked happy, or at least convinced we were. I held the photo for a long time, tracing the edges, trying to connect that woman in the picture to the one now sitting on the edge of the bed with her feet dangling, unsure of what came next. When I tucked the photo back into the drawer, I did so gently. Not out of reverence, but because I didn't know what else to do with it. Later that afternoon, I stepped out to the store, a mundane task, but one that felt monumental. As I walked through the aisles, I found myself slowing near the home repair section, eyes grazing over items I didn't need: screwdrivers, nails, sealant. My fingers brushed over a small pack of sandpaper, and for a moment, I pictured him using it. His hands, worn but steady. Back at home, I unpacked the groceries robotically. I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because it filled the time. As I stirred the spoon in slow circles, the front doorbell rang. My hand froze over the cup. No one rang the bell in our building. Neighbors usually knocked, polite, predictable. But this sound was different. Intentional. I wiped my hands and walked slowly toward the door. The hallway was quiet. Through the peephole, I saw him. He wasn't holding tools this time. Just a paper bag and that same expression, unreadable. Calm, but with something underneath that I recognized now. A kind of waiting. I opened the door before I had time to think myself out of it. "I was just passing by," he said, holding up the bag. "Thought you might like these. Fresh from the bakery." I stepped aside without saying a word. He walked in like he had before, but we both knew something had changed. The space between us had narrowed. Not just physically, but in the air, in the things unsaid. I placed the bag on the kitchen counter and pulled out a pastry. He leaned against the counter, watching me. I didn't know if you'd want to see me, he said. I didn't know. Either, I replied, surprised at the honesty in my voice. There was a pause, a kind of stillness where something could have slipped in, an apology, an explanation. But instead, we both let the silence settle. It felt safer that way. We moved into the living room, where the afternoon sun lit the floor in soft lines. I sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in my lap. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, leaning forward slightly. I've been thinking about the other day, he said. So have I answered. His eyes held mine for a long time, and I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing forward. But he didn't push. He just waited, allowing me space to speak first. If I wanted to. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pretending to straighten a row of books that hadn't been touched in months. My husband comes back in a few days, I said, my voice calm but low. He won't notice anything. He rarely does. That's not why I'm here, he said, and the sincerity in his tone made me pause. I turned to face him. Then why are you? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was softer. Because I haven't stopped thinking about you. Not since the first time we talked. I looked away, toward the window where a single curtain shifted in the breeze. The sky outside had begun to darken, a faint promise of rain clinging to the clouds. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't plan any of this. Neither did I. That kind of honesty was disarming. We weren't playing roles or building fantasies. We were just two people who had wandered into something too complicated to name. He stood then, not abruptly, but with a kind of purpose. I watched as he walked toward the door, hesitating with his hand on the knob. I can go, he said. If that's what you want. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply looked at him, and in that silence, something passed between us, not decision, not commitment, but understanding. He stayed. That evening, we didn't talk much. He helped me prepare dinner, nothing elaborate, just pasta and a salad. We moved around each other easily, like we had done it before. Like this was a life we'd lived, somewhere in another version of ourselves. After the meal, he washed the dishes while I dried. We worked in quiet rhythm, side by side, and for the first time in a long while, I felt what it was like to be part of something simple, unremarkable, and deeply human. When he left later that night, he didn't kiss me again. There were no lingering touches, no dramatic farewells. Just a quiet goodbye and the soft click of the door closing behind him. I stood in the entryway long after he'd gone, listening to the echo of my own breath. Upstairs, I imagined him walking into his apartment, setting down his keys, and maybe, just maybe, thinking about the way my hand had brushed his while passing him a towel. I in bed, I didn't turn off the light right away. I lay there, watching the shadows move along the ceiling. The screw was still on the edge of the sink. I hadn't touched it, not because I'd forgotten, but because it was the one thing that still hadn't been fixed. There was something about the following morning that felt suspended, as if time itself had paused just long enough for me to notice the subtle dissonance of my surroundings. The apartment looked unchanged, yet every object carried the weight of something new, a presence, an echo of the previous night, a stillness that wasn't quite silence. The mug he used sat by the sink, rinsed but not dried. I left it there, unable to bring myself to return it to the cabinet. Not yet. The tablecloth had a faint wrinkle where his elbow had rested. I smoothed it out with the flat of my palm, only to crease it again unintentionally. That gesture, so simple, somehow felt more intimate than anything we'd said. There were no declarations, no grand gestures. But there was weight in the quiet. And in the quiet, I could feel the shift, like stepping out onto a frozen lake. And hearing the first hairline crack beneath your feet. I moved through the morning carefully. Made coffee. Folded towels. I vacuumed the hallway just to fill the air with some kind of sound. But the silence always returned, pressing in from all directions. Not unwelcome, but unavoidable. A silence that followed me like a reflection, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't message. I didn't either. And still, it didn't feel over. If anything, the pause was mutual. Like we both knew space was needed. But that space only made my thoughts grow louder. I found myself cleaning areas I usually ignored, the drawer with takeout menus, the cabinet above the fridge. Every time I pulled something down, I expected to find something metaphorical, something symbolic, a forgotten receipt, an old note. Instead, I found dust and expired spices. I wasn't sure what disappointed me more, the absence of revelation or my need for one. Around midday, I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the screw again. Still there, unmoved. It wasn't significant in itself, but it had become a symbol. Now, not just of the repair, but of everything left unresolved. I picked it up, felt its cool weight in my palm, then set it down again. I couldn't throw it away. I didn't know why. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my husband. His voice was distant, almost muffled by the usual background noise. Of airports or taxis, flight got rescheduled, he said. I'll be back late tomorrow instead of Friday. I said, okay, and that was it. No follow-up. No questions. No, how are you holding up? The call ended as quickly as it began, leaving behind a hollow space that should have been filled with something, concern, affection, anything at all. I stood there, phone still in hand, staring at the screen long after it had gone dark. It wasn't that I wanted him to interrogate me, or even that I had something I needed to confess. But in that moment, the emotional distance between us became almost physical. Like two people in the same house but separated by walls so thick, even shouting wouldn't help. I made dinner that night out of habit more than hunger. Something simple, grilled vegetables and rice. As I ate, I watched the sun dip below the buildings outside, casting long shadows across the floor. I tried to focus on the flavors, the textures, anything tangible. But everything tasted muted, like the air had settled into my food. Later, I stood by the window with my tea, looking at the building across the way. His window was lit this time. A soft yellow glow framed the glass, and I could see movement, indistinct, but familiar. The shape of him passing by, pausing, perhaps adjusting something. I watched for longer than I should have. It felt intrusive, even voyeuristic, but I couldn't stop. There was something comforting about his presence, even from a distance. A reminder that I hadn't imagined it all. The next morning came quickly. I barely slept. My mind had cycled through memories and imagined conversations all night. I kept thinking about what I'd say if I saw him again. Would I thank him again? Apologize? Pretend nothing had changed, but the question that haunted me most wasn't about him. It was about myself. Who was I becoming? There was a version of me that had existed not so long ago, the version that folded towels perfectly, that remembered her husband's favorite cereal, that made mental checklists and stuck to them. But that version had begun to blur, her edges softening, her shape shifting into something less defined and more alive. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk, something I rarely did alone anymore. I put on a coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the city felt in motion. People passed with bags and phones and laughter. I moved slower than the rest, taking in the storefronts, the parked bicycles, the smell of bread from a nearby bakery. I didn't plan on going anywhere in particular, but my feet seemed to know. Before I realized what I was doing, I had turned the corner toward the park, the small one with the rusted bench and overgrown hedges. I used to sit there in the early years of our marriage, reading on Sundays while my husband ran errands. I sat on that same bench now, pulling my coat tighter, feeling the cold through the worn wood. I watched a dog chase a leaf across the grass, its owner laughing behind it. Nearby, two teenagers whispered behind shared earbuds. Life was continuing, messy, imperfect, beautiful, all around me. And I felt both a part of it and apart from it. After a while, I stood and walked back slowly. The sun had begun to dip, and the sky turned that peculiar shade between gold and gray. When I reached my building, I paused before entering. My reflection in the glass door caught me off guard. I looked older, maybe more tired. But there was something else, a sharpness in the eyes, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there. Before upstairs, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of yesterday's tea still lingered faintly. I removed my coat, set down my keys, and let the silence greet me like an old friend. Then came the knock. It was soft. Not hurried. But deliberate. I didn't need to ask who it was. When I opened the door, he was standing there again, hands in his pockets, eyes steady. I was going for a walk, he said, and I thought I'd check in. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen this time, the small table between us holding nothing but 2 cups of tea. There was no pastry. No toolbox. Just presence. We talked about mundane things. The weather. The traffic. A show he'd seen. I spoke less, but not out of reluctance. I was listening more. Listening to the way he paused between thoughts, the way his gaze flickered when I asked something simple. He was thinking, too. Carrying weight, even if he didn't say it aloud. Eventually, I stood to refill the kettle. He followed, helping out of habit. Our movements synchronized like muscle memory. As I turned to pass him a towel, our hands touched again, and we kissed. It was quiet. No build-up. No soundtrack. Just the air between us narrowing until it disappeared. When he left later that evening, he didn't look back. And I didn't watch him go. Instead, I stood alone in the hallway, one hand still resting on the doorknob, the other hanging by my side. That night, I picked up the screw from the sink and placed it in the drawer next to the photo from Vermont, not because it belonged there, but because I didn't know where else to put the pieces of myself that no longer fit the life I had built. The morning light slipped through the sheer curtains, casting long lines across the wooden floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, watching the steam fade slowly in the quiet air. I hadn't heard from him since he left the evening before. There was no message, no sign, and yet I wasn't surprised. It felt like everything that needed to be said had already happened in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't beg for words but lingers like a shadow, familiar, quiet, and too close to ignore. I went about my morning rituals slower than usual. The movements felt mechanical, like I was acting out a version of myself I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Toothbrush. Face cream. Folding the blanket at the end of the bed. I paused before opening the closet, standing still with my hand on the handle, unsure whether I wanted to see my husband's neatly arranged shirts waiting for him. Eventually, I opened the door and turned away before the details could settle into my vision. He would be back by evening. His flight was on schedule, and judging by the absence of follow-up messages, nothing had changed on his end. Everything was still moving according to plan. That phrase echoed in my mind, according to plan. It was how he spoke about our life. Holidays, weekends, renovations, conversations. All scheduled, organized, executed with quiet efficiency. And somewhere along the line, I had slipped out of that plan. Or maybe I had been omitted from it altogether. I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, but nothing looked appealing. I closed it again and ran my fingers along the countertop. My eyes paused at the spot where he'd leaned the night before. The surface held no trace of him now, but I remembered it, the way his presence had filled the room like warmth on a cold morning. And I realized something with a clarity that startled me. It wasn't passion I craved. It wasn't romance or rebellion or escape. It was recognition. The feeling of being visible, heard, held in a moment that wasn't transactional or expected, but real. I spent most of the day cleaning, not out of duty, but in a desperate attempt to quiet the noise inside my head. I scrubbed corners I had ignored for years, wiped down cabinet doors, and even reorganized the spice rack again. Each drawer, each surface, became a battleground for distraction. But my thoughts fought back harder. Around mid-afternoon, I took out the suitcase from the hallway closet. The same one my husband always used. I unzipped it slowly, checking if he had packed anything extra this time, as he often did. A spare tie. A gift shop souvenir. There was nothing. Just the usual, folded shirts, charger cords, cologne, the one I used to love and now could barely notice. As I placed the suitcase beside the wardrobe, I found myself wondering what he would see when he came home. Would he notice the changed pillowcases? The rearranged books on the shelf? Would he sense that the air in the apartment carried a different weight? The doorbell rang around 5. It wasn't him. It was a delivery. A parcel addressed to him. Likely work-related. I signed without thinking and set the box near the hallway mirror, where it stood like a silent observer of everything unsaid. By 6, I began preparing dinner. I chose a simple meal, one I knew he liked: roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, a light salad. The motions felt rehearsed, my hands moving as if guided by muscle memory. I couldn't remember the last time I cooked for him without resentment, or expectation, or silence thick enough to choke on. The table was set by 7. The candles were lit, a habit I had abandoned years ago but revived now out of instinct, perhaps guilt, perhaps defiance. The flame flickered, too bright against the stillness of the room. He walked in at 7:14. The click of the door was unmistakable. I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the dish towel, waiting for the sound of his steps to move down the hall. When he appeared, rolling his suitcase behind him, his eyes went first to the table. "You cooked," he said. It wasn't a question. Just a statement. I nodded. I thought it would be nice. He stepped forward, removing his coat. "Smells good. What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I replied. "Just felt like it." We sat. We ate. He complimented the chicken. Asked about the plumbing. Mentioned a delay at the airport. I responded where necessary, smiled when required. But underneath every word, there was the silent tremor of something waiting to be said. I wondered if he could feel it. The way the air refused to settle. When dinner was done, he stood and brought his plate to the sink. I watched him rinse it, place it carefully into the dishwasher, and dry his hands without looking at me. His movements were familiar, practiced, automatic. "I'm going to shower," he said. "It's been a long day." I nodded again, and he disappeared down the hall. I sat alone at the table for several minutes after the water started running. The candle had burned down halfway, the wax forming a quiet pool at its base. I stared into the flame, waiting for the courage to say something, anything. Eventually, I stood and blew it out. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. He had fallen asleep quickly, his body turned slightly away from mine. The space between us felt colder than it had in weeks. I shifted slightly, not enough to disturb him, but just to feel the edge of the mattress beneath my hand. In that moment, I understood. something I had been avoiding. The distance between us wasn't created by betrayal or neglect or even time. It had been built brick by brick, in all the moments where we had chosen silence over truth. Where comfort replaced connection. Where loyalty became routine, the betrayal wasn't in the kiss. It was in the years of absence while still sharing the same bed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched the first hints of dawn creep across the walls, soft and indifferent. I rose before the alarm and made coffee. He joined me in the kitchen an hour later, dressed and ready to leave for the office. We exchanged brief words, like colleagues in a shared workspace. Before he left, he paused at the door. "Thanks for dinner," he said. I nodded, and he was gone. I stood there for a long time after, the mug warm in my hands, the morning quiet stretching out like a long road. Upstairs, I imagined him, the neighbor, also awake, maybe making his own coffee, maybe thinking about nothing. Or maybe everything. I didn't know if I would see him again, but I knew something had changed, and no matter what happened next, I couldn't go back to who I was before. The day unfolded with a muted rhythm, like a song playing quietly in another room. I moved through it as if underwater, present, aware, but slightly detached. My husband had gone to work that morning without asking me how I slept, without noticing that I hadn't. He had always been a man of routines, and I, once upon a time, had found comfort in that. Now, those same routines felt like walls. The apartment felt hollow in his absence, though not because I missed him. It was the kind of emptiness that surfaces when a conversation needs to happen but hasn't. I kept thinking about the way he paused at the door before leaving. That small, hesitant glance over his shoulder. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't even concern. It was the look of someone who knew something was missing but wasn't sure whether to name it or ignore it. I made breakfast late, letting the morning hours pass without urgency. Toast, 1 egg, black coffee. The same meal I'd eaten 100 times before, but this time I didn't finish it. I stared at the plate for a long time, then rinsed everything under the tap and stacked it in the drying rack like the remnants of a ritual that no longer had meaning. The screw was still in the drawer beside the photograph. I opened it once, looked at them both, then closed it again. Some things weren't ready to be handled. That afternoon, I stood by the window with a book in hand, pretending to read. My eyes didn't move across the page. They were drawn outside, toward the familiar window on the 4th floor. The curtains were drawn, but a soft shadow moved behind them. I wondered if he saw me too. I wondered if he was thinking the same thing, if there was a next step, or if this was the quiet aftermath of something that had already reached its end. I didn't want drama. I didn't want declarations or decisions. I just wanted honesty. And maybe, for once, I wanted to be the one to speak first. So I wrote a note. It was short. Just a few lines, nothing poetic, nothing dramatic. A simple message. I don't know what this is, or what it's supposed to be. But I needed you to know that it mattered. That you mattered. I folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope, then sat with it in my hands for a long time before deciding to walk up the stairs. I didn't take the elevator. I wanted the time, the quiet between floors, to settle my thoughts. When I reached his door, I hesitated. There were sounds inside, the clinking of dishes, a low hum of music. I considered knocking but decided against it. I slid the envelope under the door, then turned and walked away without waiting. I didn't expect anything in return. I just needed to release it. Back home, the apartment felt smaller somehow. Or maybe I had grown, just enough to feel its tightness. I opened the windows to let in fresh air, hoping the breeze would carry away the tension. By evening, I had received no reply. No knock at the door. I told myself that was fine. I had said what I needed to say. That should be enough. But doubt has a way of finding cracks. It settles into the smallest spaces and waits. At 7, my husband returned. He hung his coat without speaking, loosened his tie, and walked into the kitchen. I heard the fridge open, then close. The sound of a bottle being uncapped. He poured himself water and leaned against the counter, staring at the tiled floor. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, and I turned to face him. His voice was quiet but steady. "About us. About this space between us." I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear where it would go, how he would shape the words we had both been avoiding. "I don't know when it started," he continued. "The silence. The distance. I thought maybe it was just time. That we'd fallen into a rhythm. But lately it feels like we're two people passing in a hallway." I nodded slightly. It wasn't accusatory. Just honest. He looked up at me then. Not with anger or hurt, but with something softer. Something like regret. "I don't think either of us meant for this to happen." "No," I said. "We didn't." He stepped away from the counter and walked toward the living room. I followed, sitting opposite him on the couch, the coffee table a familiar divide. "I've been so focused on work, on planning everything, that I didn't notice how much I'd stopped seeing you," he said. "You still see me," I replied. "But only as someone who's there. Not someone who's here." The words hung between us. I wasn't angry. Just tired. I don't want to lose what we had, he said after a long pause. But I don't know how to fix what we've become. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the note I had slipped under a different door. About the quiet moments that had spoken louder than anything said aloud. About the way it felt to be known, really known, by someone who wasn't trying to fix anything. I don't know either, I finally said. But I know we can't keep pretending. Everything's fine. He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like we were on opposite sides. We didn't come to any conclusions that night. No plans. No ultimatums. Just a shared recognition that something had cracked, not suddenly, but over time. A slow erosion. And now, we were standing at its edge. After he went to bed, I stayed up. I moved to the balcony and sat with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the wind move through the trees below. The city was quieter at that hour, its usual clamor softened by night. I didn't feel peace, exactly. But I felt clarity, sometime. After midnight, I heard movement above, a door closing, footsteps on the landing. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I simply closed my eyes and let the air settle around me. In the quiet, I knew that whatever happened next, it would not be a return to before. It would not be a clean break or a sudden revelation. It would be slow, complex, uneven. And it would belong to me, not to the woman who kept routines out of fear. Not to the wife who waited at the door. But to the version of myself that had been asleep for too long and was finally beginning to wake up. The following morning brought with it a kind of heaviness that wasn't tied to lack of sleep or physical fatigue, but rather the weight of emotional residue. I moved slowly through the apartment, carrying with me the memory of the conversation with my husband like a folded letter in my pocket, read but unresolved. He had already left for the office by the time I emerged from the bedroom, his coffee cup rinsed and drying beside the sink, his side of the bed carefully made. A quiet return to routine, though we both knew something had shifted. I wandered from room to room as if trying to inhabit the space differently. I paused at the bookshelf, ran my fingers over the spines of novels I hadn't opened in years. I straightened a picture frame that had been slightly askew for months. Every action was deliberate, a small gesture of control in a life that had suddenly unraveled at the edges. The envelope I had slid under my neighbor's door remained unacknowledged. There had been no knock. No message. No returned words of any kind. I told myself it didn't matter, that the act of writing had been for me. But there was a quiet sting in the absence of response, a kind of ache I hadn't anticipated. I had exposed a piece of myself, even gently, and it now hung in the air, unanswered. In the afternoon, I stepped out. I needed air, movement, something to pull me out of the loop of thoughts that had begun to tighten like a noose. I walked aimlessly at first, through familiar streets, past the bakery where the smell of yeast and sugar used to comfort me. I didn't go in. I wasn't hungry. Instead, I kept walking until I reached a small square lined with benches and tired shrubs. I sat there, coat wrapped around me, watching people pass. There was a woman with a stroller, humming softly to the child inside. A pair of elderly men played chess on a cracked table near the fountain, their moves slow and deliberate. A teenager sat alone with earbuds in, mouthing lyrics to a song I couldn't hear. Life continued in loops around me, ordinary and unaffected. I stayed longer than I expected, soaking in the anonymity, the privilege of being nobody in a crowd. Eventually, I made my way back home. The apartment greeted me with its usual silence. Broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside. Mail had come while I was gone. I sorted through it absently, bills, circulars, a letter from our insurance provider. And then, nestled between a catalog and an envelope addressed in mechanical type, was a small card. No return address. My name, handwritten in neat cursive. On the front. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside, a single sentence: I saw your note. I didn't know what to say. That was all. No signature. No elaboration. Just the quiet echo of acknowledgement. I reread it several times, as if more meaning might surface with each pass. But it remained what it was, simple, bare, incomplete. And yet it was enough to stir something in me: relief, frustration, confusion. I folded the card closed and placed it inside the same drawer with the screw and the photograph. The quiet museum of my unraveling. That evening, I cooked for myself. Not out of obligation or routine, but because I needed to nourish something, if not my body, then perhaps my resolve. I chose ingredients carefully, poured myself a glass of wine, and let music play softly in the background. The kitchen felt warmer than it had in weeks, the act of caring for myself something almost sacred. Later, I sat by the window with my journal, a habit I'd abandoned long ago. I wrote not about events, but about emotions, the dull ache of waiting, the small flame of being noticed, the brittle edge of guilt that never quite softened. I didn't write names. I didn't try to make sense of the arc. I just poured it out like water that had been trapped behind a dam. The next day passed quietly. My husband returned from work late, distracted, speaking mostly about meetings and upcoming deadlines. I listened, nodded in the right places, and offered a plate of reheated leftovers. He accepted with a tired smile. There was no tension, but also no intimacy. We were two people playing parts in a play neither of us remembered auditioning for. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. My mind drifted to the note, the one I had written, the one I had received. I wondered if he was still thinking about it, or if he had already closed that chapter. Quietly in his mind. I wondered if I should reply, if I should reach out again, or if silence was the closest thing to closure either of us could manage, but more than anything, I wondered what I truly wanted. I had spent so long tending to the needs of others, smoothing over the rough patches, maintaining appearances, honoring commitments that felt more like contracts. And somewhere in the midst of all that care, I had lost the sound of my own voice. In the morning, I called in sick to the volunteer shift I was supposed to cover. I needed a day to myself, a space free of expectation. I made tea, brought a blanket to the couch, and opened a book I had started months ago but never finished. The words were slow at first, my attention drifting, but eventually, the story pulled me in. As I turned the pages, I felt a quiet shift, not in the plot, but in myself. A sense that I didn't need to chase resolution right away. That maybe some questions could remain unanswered for a while. That maybe what I needed most wasn't clarity, but stillness. In the late afternoon, I took a walk through the building's courtyard. The air smelled like wet concrete and fallen leaves. I noticed a few new cracks along the brick wall near the side entrance, small, hairline fissures that had formed with time and weather. No one had marked them. No one had repaired them. They were just there, visible, and somehow, that made them bearable. The finality of certain realizations does not come like thunder or storm, it settles in slowly, like dusk, subtle and inevitable. Over the next few days, I noticed how I moved differently. Through the apartment. I wasn't avoiding rooms or avoiding people, but I was undeniably quieter. There was less urgency in my responses, less instinct to fix or smooth things over. I had begun to observe, not out of detachment, but as a way of reorienting myself. In a life that had begun to feel less like a shared map and more like parallel paths. My husband and I had fallen into a rhythm again, though not the kind we used to call stability. It was more like a fragile coordination. We exchanged information in the form of sentences, avoided deeper tones. He made coffee, I made dinner. We watched the same news segments at night without really absorbing them. If he noticed I was more reserved, he didn't ask. And maybe that was the clearest sign of how far we drifted, not the silence, but the comfort with it. I thought about writing another note. Not to him. To the neighbor. I had imagined several versions of what I might say. One part of me wanted to thank him again for seeing me, even if only for a moment. Another part of me wanted to ask why the note had stopped there, why he hadn't said more. But ultimately, I did neither. I left the pen and paper where they were and chose to move through the uncertainty instead of trying to patch it. That Thursday, I found myself rearranging the hallway closet. It started as an innocent task, I'd meant only to grab a light jacket, but quickly became a 2-hour dive into the sediment of forgotten belongings. Old shoes, a broken umbrella, scarves I hadn't worn in years. And behind them, a box I didn't recognize. It was small and unmarked, the cardboard soft at the edges. I opened it on the living room floor, half expecting it to be filled with extension cords or mismatched holiday lights. Instead, it held photographs. Dozens of them. Some in envelopes, some loose. Our wedding, vacations, friends we hadn't seen in decades. A few of the pictures were faded at the corners. In some, I was laughing. In others, smiling politely. I sat there with the photos spread around me like fallen leaves. The one that caught my eye wasn't from an anniversary or trip, but an ordinary moment, me in the kitchen, mid-sentence, my husband blurry in the background, pouring coffee. It must have been taken without us knowing. I studied my own face for a long time. There was something open in my expression, something that had been absent lately. Not joy, exactly. But presence. I set the photos aside and went to wash my hands. The day had grown warm, and the sink water felt cold against my wrists. As I dried them, I caught my reflection in the mirror above the stove. I looked older, yes. But also less afraid. That evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I walked out onto the balcony. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and leaned against the railing, looking up toward the 4th floor. His window was dark. I waited a moment, then turned my eyes away. I didn't need a sign from him anymore. Whatever had passed between us had been real, but it had served its purpose. It woke me up. It reminded me that I could feel something beyond the numbness of habit. That I could still choose. A soft breeze rustled the trees below. The city was quiet in that suspended way it sometimes becomes late at night, holding its Breath, waiting. I let myself breathe deeply. I didn't need to decide anything right away. But I needed to be honest. And that started with myself. The next morning, I made a plan, not a schedule or a checklist, but an intention. I would talk. To my husband. Not to accuse or explain. But to be truthful. To say what had been sitting inside me for months, maybe years. He came home early that day, a rare occurrence. I offered him tea, and he accepted. We sat in the living room, the mugs between us, neither of us reaching for them. I need to tell you something, I said. He looked at me and waited. No reaction. No interruption. Just stillness. I felt alone for a long time. I began. And I think you have too. We just didn't say it. He didn't respond right away, but his eyes didn't leave mine. I don't blame you, I continued. But I also can't keep pretending that I'm not disappearing in this house. That we're not strangers most of the time. He took a breath, as if preparing to speak, but then let it out slowly. I don't know how we got here, he said finally. I do, I replied. We stopped looking at each other. Stopped asking questions. We just managed things. Like a business. He lowered his gaze for a moment, then nodded. I wasn't sure what I expected after that. A fight. A flood of emotions. But instead, there was a quiet kind of acknowledgement in the air, a shared understanding that we were both finally standing in the same room emotionally, not just physically. I think we need time, I said. Space, maybe. To figure out what's left and whether we still want to build something from it. I don't want to lose you, he said softly. I don't want to lose myself, I answered. We didn't resolve anything that night. We didn't make a decision. But the honesty sat between us like something sacred, untouched for too long, now finally visible. Later, I walked into the kitchen, opened the drawer, and took out the screw, the card, and the photograph. I placed them together in a small cloth bag, pulled the drawstring tight, and set it in the back of my closet, not because I wanted to forget, but because it was time to carry forward with lighter hands. That night, I fell asleep without the usual weight in my chest. Not peace. Not closure. But something closer to alignment. I had spoken. I had chosen myself, and tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, would be a day not built on silence. It rained the next morning. Not a storm, not heavy or sudden, but a quiet, persistent drizzle that blurred the windows and softened the outlines of everything outside. I woke up earlier than usual, the kind of early that doesn't feel like obligation but like inevitability. My body simply rose with the light, my thoughts already waiting for me before my feet touched the floor. The apartment was hushed, the kind of hush that accompanies big shifts. My husband was still asleep, his breathing steady, turned slightly away from me in bed. There had been no confrontation the night before, no demands, no closure. Just words. And though words rarely solve everything, sometimes they release enough tension to allow silence to feel less like avoidance and more like reprieve. I stepped quietly through the house. In the kitchen, I made tea instead of coffee, something gentler. For the day ahead. I stood near the stove with the mug in my hands, letting the steam rise against my face. Outside the window, the streets looked washed, rinsed clean of the dust that had gathered through the week. A fresh start, maybe, though I knew better than to believe in such convenient metaphors. Later, I walked through the apartment with a slow deliberation, taking in the corners and objects I had ignored for too long. A lamp with a crooked shade. A drawer that stuck halfway when opened. A bowl with a small crack running through its edge that I'd always meant to replace. I touched each of these things gently, as if they too had stories, as if they too had been waiting to be seen around. Mid-morning, I sat down with a notebook and began to write. Not letters this time. Not reflections or pleas. Just lists. Honest, direct lists. Things I needed. Things I feared. Things I missed. I wrote without judgment, allowing each word to land plainly, like pebbles in water, under the heading, what I need. I wrote, time, stillness, truth, laughter, touch, a sense of my own edges again. Under, what I fear, I wrote, regret, wasted years, being invisible, starting over, staying stuck. And under, what I miss, the list grew longer than I expected. Spontaneous hugs, the sound of my name spoken with affection, shared meals that weren't measured by silence, days where I didn't second-guess every feeling. When I finished, I didn't reread it. I folded the paper once and placed it inside a book on the coffee table. Not to hide it, but to hold it somewhere I might stumble across later. By noon, the rain had turned to mist, a light fog hanging above the sidewalk. I decided to walk. I needed movement, not just for my legs, but for my thoughts. I dressed simply, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped outside without a destination. The city was slow under the damp weather. People moved quickly under umbrellas, cars sent soft sprays of water up onto the curbs, and the air smelled faintly of earth. I took a long route around the neighborhood, passing small stores and shuttered cafes. I paused in front of a bookstore. Its window fogged from inside, a display of poetry books pressed against the glass. One of the covers showed a woman standing alone in a field, looking upward. I didn't go in, but the image stayed with me. Eventually, I returned home, my coat damp, my hair curling slightly at the edges. I hung everything carefully by the door and made my way to the living room, where the soft hum of the heater welcomed me back. That afternoon, I received a message from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. She had moved out of state last year. And our conversations had thinned into the occasional comment on a photo, the occasional like. But this time, she wrote, "You've been on my mind. Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. I could have said yes. Could have said I was fine. But something in me resisted the old habit of dismissal. So I typed, "Not really. But I think I'm getting there." She replied almost immediately, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No expectations." That small offer of presence, distant but real, cracked something open in me again. It reminded me that connection could come from unexpected places. That not all healing had to come from the same sources that caused the wound. When my husband returned home that evening, he seemed tired but less distracted than usual. He asked how my day was, and I answered honestly, not with details, but with tone. "It was a quiet day," I said. "I needed it." He nodded, and though there was no follow-up, his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. We ate dinner together without television. I had prepared a simple soup and warmed some bread, and we shared it with an ease that surprised me. There was no talk of the past, no pressing of emotions. Just the presence of two people who were learning to sit with the unknown. Later, I stepped out onto the balcony again. The clouds had broken, revealing a stretch of pale sky where stars were beginning to emerge. The air was cool against my skin, and I let it in fully, not shrinking away. I looked up, instinctively, toward the fourth floor. His window was dark again. And for the first time, I didn't feel disappointment. Just acceptance. Whatever that connection had been, it had mattered. It had stirred something awake. But its purpose had never been permanence, it had been revelation. I was still standing. Still breathing. Still capable of change, and that, I realized, was enough. The night passed gently, and when I slipped into bed, I didn't carry the usual tension in my shoulders. My husband had already fallen asleep. His breathing was deep and even. I watched him for a moment, not with anger or longing, but with a calm curiosity. We were not who we used to be. And maybe we never would be again. But the space between us was no longer filled with pretense. There was air there now. Possibility. I closed my eyes and let sleep come slowly, without resistance. Outside, the rain had stopped, and inside, I was learning what it meant to begin again, not with declarations or certainty, but with small, quiet steps toward myself. This morning felt different, though I couldn't tell whether it was the weather, my body, or simply the quiet knowledge that something was reaching its natural end. The light outside was soft, the clouds dispersed, almost transparent, as if the sky, too, had nothing left to prove. I stood by the kitchen counter holding a cup of tea, watching the steam rise, listening to the familiar sounds of the building, the elevator clicking somewhere in the distance, a door opening, then closing, then footsteps moving down the hall. Life was continuing, as it always does. And so was I. There was no dramatic turning point, no pivotal conversation to mark this transition. But internally, I felt it, a loosening. The tension that had gripped my chest for weeks, maybe months, had softened. Not disappeared, but loosened enough to allow breath to come more freely. I opened the window above the sink and let in the morning air. It smelled faintly of dew and faintly of the bakery across the street beginning its prep for the day. That scent used to make me ache. Now it simply arrived, passed through, and stayed only briefly. My husband was still asleep. I had heard him shift sometime around dawn, murmuring something unintelligible, then falling still again. We'd begun to talk more since that first real conversation. Not deeply, not with immediate resolution, but enough to feel as though we were no longer afraid of our own words. That in itself felt like a victory. I thought back to the earlier days of our marriage, the initial eagerness to know one another, the daily negotiations that we mistook for compatibility. I had loved him. Still did, in many ways. But the love had changed, quieted, aged. It no longer burned. It rested. And in that resting, I had begun to see not only what we had built together, but also what had gone untouched. I spent part of the morning going through old clothes. Not with the intent to throw them away or make symbolic gestures, but simply to make space. I pulled sweaters from high shelves, dresses I hadn't worn in years, a few scarves I'd forgotten I owned. Some of the fabrics still held memories of dinners, events, moments when I felt briefly beautiful. I folded what I wanted to keep and placed the rest into a box to donate. The act was quiet, meditative, even kind. Around noon, I walked to the post office. The sidewalk was dotted with puddles from the night's light rain, and the trees along the street were beginning to bloom. It reminded me that spring was near. That even after long seasons of cold and quiet, the world always finds its way back. To color. I mailed a letter I had written the night before. Not to anyone from my past, not to the neighbor or even to a friend. It was addressed to myself, or rather, to the version of me I had nearly abandoned in the name of endurance. The letter was a promise, not of change, but of continued presence. To keep showing up for myself. To keep choosing truth over silence. When I returned home, I found the apartment as I had left it, still, calm, waiting. My husband arrived a little after 5. He looked tired, the way people look when they've been carrying too many unsaid things. We had dinner at the table again, both of us quieter than usual, but not withdrawn. Just reflective. Afterwards, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while he dried. This time, there was no awkwardness. No anxious glances. Just the shared rhythm of two people existing side by side. I've been thinking, he said, placing a plate carefully into the cabinet. About taking a few days off work. I looked over at him. Really? He nodded. I don't know. Maybe we could get out of the city. Change the scenery a little. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a full idea. But it was something. A small attempt to re-engage. Okay, I said. Let's talk about it. We left it at that. And somehow, that felt right. Later that night, I sat on the balcony again. The city stretched out beneath me, lit softly by street lamps and windows. I thought about all that had unfolded. Not just the moments with the neighbor, the letters, the internal shifts, but everything that had led up to them. Years of compromise. Years of quiet. Years of assuming that love meant not disturbing the waters, but now I knew better. Love wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the willingness to stay, to listen, to tell the truth even when it trembled in your throat. My thoughts wandered back to him, the neighbor. The quiet gestures, the honesty in his gaze, the way he'd stepped into my life not as a storm, but as a mirror. I didn't regret what had passed between us. It had mattered. Deeply. But I also didn't feel the same pull anymore. I no longer waited for a knock at the door or a glance through the window. I had found what I needed, and it was never really about him. It was about me. The version of myself who had been lost under years of silence had begun to surface. She was quieter now, more discerning. But she was present. I went inside and turned off the lights. My husband had already gone to bed, and I joined him without ceremony. We didn't speak. But before he drifted off, he reached for my hand under the covers. I let him take it. It wasn't a solution. But it was an offering. As I closed my eyes, I thought of the screw I had tucked away, the card, the photograph, the letter to myself. Artifacts of a story that was never about betrayal or escape, but about becoming. I didn't know what the future would bring. I didn't have a script or a plan. But I had something better, myself, awake and paying attention, and finally, that was enough.
Bye.